If you speak to women, they will say men of all backgrounds have been predatory, whether it's a woman saying she's been groped in a club, whether it's someone saying that there's been predatory behavior in the Catholic Church, even within mosques, if we're being frank and honest, there's been concerns there as well. The issue has always been men.
Claim 1. Brexit has been successful in curbing the number of asylum seekers coming to the UK, which of course was what Farage and others was telling us. We're going to take back our borders, take back our country, get a load of money into the NHS. That also never happened. But what about this claim, that it was going to curb asylum seekers? True or false?
Well, it's false. And, there's a lack of cooperation between Britain and France, and it's just... I remember Farage was talking about, well, what about the Commonwealth migrants? And it was always him trying to be relevant in the media on an anti-migration claim. So EU today, asylum seekers tomorrow, and who knows what's going to be there afterwards.
Well, yes, you're absolutely correct. It is indeed a false claim. Of course, we were subject to Dublin regulation prior to leaving the EU, which meant that asylum seekers and migrants could be treated in the first European country that they arrived in and processed there. That's no longer the case. So just to give people a sense of that, we had... back then, about 30,000 asylum applications a year. We now have 85,000. So it's actually made managing the process a lot harder. So that's our first one. What about the second claim, that illegal immigration is at an all-time high and there are more undocumented migrants than actual legal migrants? True or false?
Nonsense. That's complete and utter nonsense.
You've probably heard Reform politicians say this. They've been claiming that there are 1.2 million illegal immigrants in the UK. Firstly, on this show, we reject the term illegal. So it's documented or undocumented. No one is illegal. There's no illegal people in the world. But just to be absolutely clear, they were referring to a figure that the Pew poll of 2019 had actually then corrected, because the methodology had basically left out all the people who had indefinite leave to stay in this country, which of course included many people who did have were legally allowed to remain, but they were on indefinite leave to remain. So once they revisited that figure back in 2017, it dropped from 1.2 million to between 700,000 to 900,000 people without what they call a legal status. What about this third claim? Migrants get more housing benefits than Brits do.
No, they don't. In fact, certain councils will discriminate against migrants, say you have to live in that local authority area for 5 years before being eligible for social housing. You have migrants sleeping rough on the streets of London. So it's complete nonsense.
That's also correct. So new migrants arriving in the UK are not eligible for social housing, except in very limited circumstances. Most people who come to the UK on visas to work or study have no recourse to public funds and can't receive benefits or get help with their housing. And as you mentioned, there's also this case now with many local councils also putting in this local connections rule, which privileges long-standing residents in their allocation policies. So again, just fake news being spread there. What about this claim? Muslim men are responsible for more sexual violence in crime.
I think that's false. I think if you went to look at specific offences or crimes, you can always cherry pick quotes and stuff. But overall, there's no evidence of an overrepresentation.
So 85% of group-based child abusers were white, even in the first quarter, 3 quarters of 2024. As you'd mentioned earlier, ironically, 2 in 5 arrested, though, at last summer's UK riots had been convicted of domestic abuse. But I do think there's an interesting point here that keeps coming up, particularly on the right with regards to some of these issues, which is there was an article in the Telegraph, which for our foreign audience is a right-leaning outlet here in the UK, which ran with the headline, "Foreigners are convicted of up to 23% of sex crimes." I don't know if you saw this article. The report found that 2 nationalities in particular, Afghans and Eritreans, were more than 20 times more likely to account for sexual offence convictions than British citizens, according to the data. Now, overall, foreign nationals were 71% more likely than Britons to be responsible for sex crime convictions. These are all statistics from the Telegraph article.
Sure.
Now, the right will often accuse the left of refusing to acknowledge these types of concerns, right? You've heard this, I'm sure, a million times, you know, because you're being PC, you will not deal with the fact that, you know, there are certain cultures, quote unquote, certain nationalities who are more likely to be involved in these types of crimes. And you don't want to talk about it because you don't want to be labeled a racist. How would you respond to that?
So just a few things. Firstly, that statistic has been debunked. There is some suggestions that there's an overrepresentation of Afghans in sexual crimes. You have to look at the population. Firstly, I think the Afghan population in Britain is underestimated, but also migrants and refugees and people who come to Britain are more likely to be working age. Working age people in general are more likely to commit crimes. You're not likely to have many old people from Afghanistan coming to Britain, are you? And so you have to consider all of these factors. Everyone has concerns about sexual assault. Everyone wants people to feel safe walking down the street. But if you speak to women, they will say men of all backgrounds have been predatory, whether it's a woman saying she's been groped in a club, whether it's someone saying that there's been predatory behavior in the Catholic Church, even within mosques, if we're being frank and honest, there's been concerns there as well. The issue has always been men of all backgrounds. It cuts across class dynamics, it cuts across ethnicity, and that's the issue. How do we make women feel safer on our streets? I think we should take robust action against any individual. I think we should know, I don't think it's controversial to say we should know who's coming in and out of the country, but the only way we would have that robust system is if we have safe and legal routes for asylum seekers. If you don't create a sensible asylum system where we know who's coming in and out, where there's support, where there's actual integration, where they're allowed to work and mix in with the community, then what do you expect? If you're going to allow people trafficking gangs to bring people to Britain, and we've had stories of child refugees going missing, hundreds of child refugees in Britain going missing, being exploited by these gangs. You're putting them in hotels, you're not allowing them to work, you're giving them a small allowance. You are trying to create a condition which makes areas unsafe. And a lot of these places where asylum seekers are being put, by the way, they often put them in very deprived parts of the country. This dispersal accommodation, if you look at parts of the northeast, in places like Hartlepool and Sunderland, house prices in some areas have gone down because the area is so run down. Like it'll feel like there was a riot last week when you look at all the windows being smashed up. There's drug addiction, there's antisocial behaviour, there's crime. You're putting asylum seekers, many of whom are fleeing war and persecution and have come from broken countries where there's no real sense of government, there's no real sense of law and order. You're mixing them all in together. It's a complete disaster, our system. So I think it's in all of our interest to advocate for a fair asylum system, and so we can address people's concerns. I think it's very, very dangerous, though, when we're stereotyping ethnicities, because the reality is if I go into a predominantly white area, I am the asylum seeker to them. They're not going to differentiate. And we've had and seen people of colour who were born in this country, whose grandparents have lived here since the 60s, being targeted. So it's not even about asylum seekers or Afghans. It's a racial thing.